Now that you've completed part 4 of the reproductive system, taking a look at the female reproductive anatomy, let's move on to explain the process of ovulation. Before we get into that, let's take a look at where the organs of the female reproductive system lie within the pelvis. Taking a closer look, we can look at the parts that you ultimately labeled by going through the last part of the unit. Here we have the ovary. This is the female gonad. There are actually 2 of them, as you can see here, one on either side of the uterus. Here we have the fimbriae. Just outside both ovaries, there are fimbriae which ultimately are attached to the fallopian tube or the oviduct, 2 terms meaning the same thing. The fimbriae allow for the egg that we'll take a look at in a minute to be moved, because the fimbriae actually move and sort of coax the egg down into the fallopian tube. The fallopian tubes attach to the uterus. The uterus is made up of 3 layers: the endometrium, the innermost layer, the myometrium, which is the muscle layer of the uterus, and then the perimetrium, or epimetrium, that is around the outside of the uterus. The bottom portion of the uterus is called the cervix, and the cervix opens to the vagina. If we were to take a closer look at the ovary, we would see this. Ultimately, what we're going to go through here is the process of ovulation and what is occurring as an egg is prepared, released, and then ultimately the leftovers of what remains in the ovary after the release of the egg. As we can see labeled here as beginning, within the ovary are many tiny sac-like structures, ultimately called ovarian follicles. A female is born with about 2 million follicles. However, of these, only about 400 follicles will ever fully mature because a female only produces usually 1 egg per month. Production of eggs begins at puberty and continues until menopause, which occurs at approximately 45 to 55 years of age. As we can tell from those numbers, the supply of eggs far exceeds the actual need of eggs, because as was stated, only about 400 follicles ever mature of the 2 million that the female is born with. So let's go through this process. So we have the ovarian follicles, and each month what will happen is that one of those follicles begins to mature. Here in this image we can see the egg, or the oocyte, that is actually maturing, surrounded by the follicular cells, which are cells that help nourish the cell and allow it to develop properly. As this continues, the follicle gets bigger, and the egg is as well getting bigger, getting more nourishment, and so on, until we have ovulation, where, as we can see here, the egg is being released and will come into contact with the fimbriae and will be coaxed into the fallopian tube or oviduct. However, in yellow within the ovary, we can see that the follicular cells are not released with the egg. In the end, we have these leftover cells that do some functions that we'll take a look at in a second, but ultimately form the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is involved in releasing hormones, and that occurs for a certain amount of time, but eventually the corpus luteum will end up as the corpus albicans, and those cells have actually died off and are no longer functioning. This whole time that the corpus luteum is there, the egg is traveling down the fallopian tube towards the uterus, potentially to become fertilized. We'll take a look at fertilization or non-fertilization in a few moments, but let's move on to explain the process of ovulation in regards to the hormones that are being released. Here we're showing the hypothalamus as well as the pituitary gland. As we saw in males, the hypothalamus releasing hormones that trigger the anterior pituitary to release its hormones. In this case, the releasing hormone is called the gonadotropin releasing hormone. The gonadotropin within that name is referring to the hormones released by the anterior pituitary that will go and then act on the gonads. In the case of the female, the ovary. In the case of the male, the testes. So this gonadotropin releasing hormone is released in both males and females, but ultimately it goes to the anterior pituitary and says for it to release its hormones. Just like in the male, the female's anterior pituitary releases the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone. These ultimately are the gonadotropin hormones. They fall into that category because, as we said, the gonadotropin stands for they go and act on the gonads. If we were to take a sample of a female's blood over the course of a month, we would actually see changes that look like this in the levels of luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone within her blood. We're going to take a closer look at this in just a moment, but as we can see, there's a slight increase at the beginning of the month from follicle stimulating hormone. And then in the middle of the month, we have a surge in luteinizing hormone just prior to ovulation. And then both the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone decrease a little bit for the remainder of the month. Here's the image that we saw earlier of the uterus as well as the ovary. And if we were to actually map out the follicle and egg release and the corpus luteum that has been produced after the egg release, we'd actually see something that looks like this. And what we can see here is that there's actually this ovarian cycle that occurs monthly. There's two phases to the ovarian cycle, the follicular phase and the luteal phase. The follicular phase is the development of the egg within the follicle. As you can see from above, this is actually triggered by the release of the follicle stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. Halfway through the cycle, on day 14 of a 28-day cycle, we have ovulation. Just prior to that, as we can see in the graph here, we have the luteinizing hormone surge. This actually causes the release of the egg through the process of ovulation. The egg will then travel, as we saw before, into the fallopian tube. As the luteinizing hormone decreases, we enter into the luteal phase, where we actually have the corpus luteum within the ovary form, and it will start releasing hormones. The hormones that the corpus luteum releases will end up having an effect on the uterus. And so we want to take a look now at the uterine cycle. The uterine cycle lasts the same 28 days that we were just looking at for the ovarian cycle. But what we should notice is the various subphases as well of the uterine cycle. Though it might seem a little odd, the first phase is actually the menstrual phase, where menses occurs, referred to as the period. Following the menstrual phase, we have the proliferative phase, where we have thickening of the uterus lining, specifically of the endometrial lining of the uterus. Around day 14, at the time of ovulation, we start having the secretory phase, where there's even more thickening of the endometrial lining. What we should note is that the proliferative phase actually occurs at the same time that the follicle is developing. So how does the uterus know to begin proliferation, to begin thickening of the uterus? It's because as the follicle develops, the follicle begins to release estrogen. This hormone travels through the blood and ultimately goes to the uterus, signaling to it that the endometrium of the uterus should begin to become thicker. As you can see in the image above, there's an increase of estrogen as the follicle continues to develop during the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. What happens just prior to day 14 is that the luteinizing hormone surges, ultimately causing ovulation at day 14, but following that ovulation, we form the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum then is releasing progesterone, and so the amount of progesterone within the blood increases, traveling to the endometrium of the uterus and telling it to continue to remain thick. So again, these two hormones communicate and ultimately cause the various stages of the uterine cycle. I've tried to break it down here in order to indicate how these two systems, the ovarian system and the uterine system, communicate so that they can coordinate what's going on within each. It's important to take some time in order to process through how this works because, as you can see just looking at this picture here, there's a lot of information going on, but if you break it down, as I said, it's all about communication from the ovaries to the uterus. So what is the uterus ultimately preparing for? Well, in the end, if the egg becomes fertilized as it travels down the fallopian tube, the egg will implant into the endometrial lining of the uterus. We'll take a look at what is produced when a fertilized egg ends up implanting within the lining of the uterus. But before we do, let's describe fertilization and then the early development of the zygote. So shortly after the egg is released and it's traveling down the fallopian tube, is actually when the egg will ultimately be fertilized. Sometimes people think, oh, it happens in the uterus when the sperm meets up with the egg, but the sperm will actually travel up through the vagina, through the cervix, through the uterus, and then travel along the fallopian tubes, ultimately meeting with the oocyte shortly after it's released. So here we have ovulation occurring, the egg being released into the fallopian tube from the ovary, and then as it travels along, shown in the image here, we have fertilization somewhere along the fallopian tube. So we have the nucleus of the sperm going into the egg, and the egg cell nucleus is there as well, and the two nuclei will ultimately merge, forming the nuclei of the future offspring. As we looked at during the genetics portion of this unit, we saw that 23 chromosomes come from the mother and 23 chromosomes from the father, making for 23 pairs of chromosomes, or 46 in total, within the offspring. At this point, we actually call the fertilized egg the zygote. And then, through the process of mitosis, the zygote will undergo cell division in order to produce, at first, 2 cells. And then those 2 cells will divide to become 4 cells, and those 4 cells to become 8 cells, etc., as we move along, until finally we have a large enough number of cells that we actually call it a morula. The morula will enter into the uterus, and we start to have an early blastocyst. What you'll notice here in the early blastocyst is that we have this inner cell mass. This inner cell mass will ultimately form the baby. The cells just beneath it will go on to form the placenta, which will occur after implantation. So the early blastocyst implants into the uterus lining, the endometrium, and then we end up with the late blastocyst, where we start to have differentiation. We're forming the amniotic cavity. We can see the cells on the left here are starting to form the placenta. Something else that we should mention is that during implantation, the blastocyst also functions as a gland. The layer of flattened cells that surround the cavity secrete a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. This travels through the blood to the ovary, where it ends up preventing the deterioration of the corpus luteum. It's ultimately sending a signal back to the corpus luteum saying the female is pregnant, and that the corpus luteum should continue to release the estrogen and progesterone that stimulates the growth of the uterine wall and prevents moving into the menstruation phase because of the loss of progesterone being released by the corpus luteum. The secretion of this HCG stays high for about 2 months and then begins to decline as the placenta takes over in terms of estrogen and progesterone. In a moment, we'll take a look at the various stages that then develop out of the late blastocyst. But before we do, let's discuss the development of the embryo and the fetus. Here we have the embryo that's developing. As we can see, the embryo is sitting within now a much more complex structure than we just looked at in the last image. The embryo is surrounded by this tissue layer called the amnion. It's filled with a fluid called the amniotic fluid in which the embryo sits. Here we have the umbilical cord, which acts as the major connection between the mother and the baby. The umbilical cord has blood vessels that ultimately bring oxygenated and nutrient-rich blood from the mother into the baby, and then bring blood with high levels of carbon dioxide and waste out to the mother's blood so that then she can actually get rid of those wastes for the offspring. We have the yolk sac. The yolk sac in humans serves a couple different functions. It produces red blood cells and immature sex cells. After about the 6th week, the yolk sac ceases to function. The embryo's liver and spleen then produce its own red blood cells. By the 7th month, the red bone marrow has actually assumed this function. By then, the yolk sac has become part of the umbilical cord. Around the outside of the amniotic sac, we have the chorion. The chorion produces many finger-like projections called the chorionic villi. The chorionic villi penetrate the uterine wall and interact with the tissues of the mother's uterus and form the placenta. If we move that image off to the side, if we were to zoom in on the placenta area here, this is what we would see. So here, in this close-up of the placenta, we see the umbilical cord, the endometrium, and then the chorionic villi, those finger-like projections that we just mentioned looking at the previous image. And then, here within the chorionic villi, we have the embryonic blood vessels that ultimately allow for the exchange that we were previously mentioning, bringing oxygen and other nutrients into the embryonic circulation and getting rid of carbon dioxide and other waste out of the embryonic circulation. So now let's talk about some of the timing of human development. We've mentioned implantation already. By the time implantation occurs, we're actually in the 2nd week of embryonic development. At about the 3rd week of embryonic development, we have the beginning of the nervous system. The 4th week, we have the appearance of limb buds. The heart is starting to beat. The embryo has a tail, and other organ systems begin. So at about the 4th week, or 28 days in, the human embryo looks something like this, where we also have the beginning of the formation of the umbilical cord, the umbilical stalk. At about 6 weeks in, we have fingers and toes becoming noticeable. We also have the appearance of the cartilage skeleton. At about 8 weeks or the second month, all organ systems are developing. The cartilaginous skeleton is beginning to be replaced by bone through the process of ossification that we looked at in the skeletal system. At this point, the embryo is about 3.8 centimeters long. As we enter into the third month, we enter into the fetal phase. At 3 months, facial features are present, at least in crude form. We can also determine the gender. The external reproductive organs are distinguishable as male or female. At the 4th month, sensory organs are present. Eyes and ears attain shape and position. The eyes blink, and the baby begins sucking movements. The skeleton is also becoming visible. In the 5th month, a heartbeat can be heard during a prenatal visit. And then as we continue, the baby continues to grow, we start to have myelination of the spinal cord, the eyes are beginning to open, the testes descend into the scrotum, and at about 7 months, the baby weighs about 3 pounds, and bone marrow becomes the only site of blood cell formation. In the 8th month, the body is lean and well proportioned, and subcutaneous fat begins to be deposited. Finally, at 9 months, the baby has reached full term and is ready to be delivered. The average weight of a baby is 7.5 pounds and approximately 53 centimeters. So now that we've reached 9 months, the baby is ready to face the world. Labor is the process whereby forceful contractions expel the fetus from the uterus. Once the labor starts, forceful and rhythmic contractions begin at the top of the uterus and travel down its length, forcing the fetus through the birth canal. But in order to do that, let's talk about the stages of labor. The first stage of labor here is actually before labor begins. It's not actually a stage that is a true stage of labor. What happens is, as the baby grows bigger later in the pregnancy, it actually causes stretching of the uterine and vaginal tissue, and that stretching is sensed by receptors that send nervous signals to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus then stimulates the release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland. The oxytocin has a powerful stimulating effect on the myometrium and starts to cause myometrial contractions. So then the 3 stages of true labor begin with the dilation stage. The dilation stage begins with the onset of labor and ends with full dilation of the cervix at around 10 centimeters. This stage is characterized by rhythmic and forceful contractions, rupture of the amniotic sac, and cervical dilation. It's the longest stage of labor and generally lasts between 6 and 12 hours. The next stage is the expulsion stage. This stage generally lasts less than 1 hour. During this stage, the mother has the urge to push with her abdominal muscles, adding to the push being caused by the flexing of the myometrium. The third stage is the placental stage and occurs 10 to 15 minutes after the birth. It involves the separation of the placenta from the uterine wall and expulsion of the placenta and the attached membranes by forceful uterine contractions. The placenta and the attached membranes are collectively called the afterbirth. In addition to expelling the fetus and the placenta, the uterine contractions also cause vasoconstriction of the uterine blood vessels, thereby minimizing blood loss. Uterine contractions also help the uterus return to its normal non-pregnant size and shape.